Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Really excited to have Tim Wise talk with you for this next hour. I'm Greg Woley. I work with the City of Portland, the Bureau of Development Services. I'm also a founding board member and vice chair of DEEP, Diverse Empowered Employees of Portland. DEEP and our Office of Equity and Human Rights are hosting Tim Wise, and we also have a number of city bureaus that have contributed and partnered. I'd like to just name them briefly. The Bureau of Development Services, the Bureau of Environmental Services, Planning and Sustainability, Office of Management and Budget, Office of the City Attorney, and we also have a PSU partner in this event, and that's the PSU School of Gender, Race, and Nations. How many people have heard of that particular school? Yeah? Okay, great. Directed by Winston Grady Willis. He tells me they're developing a master's program. So if you'd like to get involved with that, make sure and talk with Mr. Grady Willis. We've also invited a number of social justice groups, including Black Lives Matter, Don't Shoot Portland, Showing Up for Racial Justice, PSU International Socialist Organization. And so if they're in the audience, feel free to identify yourselves and mix in with the group. Tim will also be signing books in the back of the auditorium following his talk. So I think a lot of you know something about Tim, or maybe have seen a video or read a book, so I won't go into a long biography. I'll just read the brief version. Tim Wise is one of the most prominent anti-racist writers and activists in the United States and has been called one of the most brilliant, articulate, and courageous critics of white privilege in the nation. Tim Wise has spoken in all 50 states on over 1,000 college campuses and has spoken to community groups around the nation. He's the author of 7 books and has contributed essays to 25 additional volumes. And he told me on the way over he's working on another book. So let's get started. I'd like for you to meet Tim Wise.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much for the good God. That's. That was really, I'm very impressed with the depth of my voice. The amplitude of my voice makes me feel incredibly mature, and I don't know, that was nice. I haven't been speaking for about 9 days, and when I got off the road 9 days ago, my voice was totally shot. It was about 3 octaves higher than this because it was like a strained whisper to get any words out, and now I'm back to like this deep, I need a radio show kind of voice kind of thing. This is really sort of freaking me out a little bit. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. It's good to be back on this campus. It's been a little bit, not too long. I'm up this way every now and then and have been certainly in Portland, not necessarily on this campus, several times since the last time I was here. It is good to be back and to talk to a group of folks that involves, I know a lot of state employees and city employees, as well as some folks here from the university. So trying to craft a message that will be of use to a lot of different constituencies is not always the easiest thing to do, but I think in the interest of simplicity that I can probably break down some things for us and allow us to have a conversation, which we'll have after my sort of formal presentation that will work for everyone. This is, I think without saying, without a lot of stretch on my part, a pretty dangerous time in this country. Not necessarily more dangerous than any other for some folks. For a lot of folks, it's very much a continuation of the same old, but I think it's fair to say that we're at a very dangerous time. It's also, I think, fair to say a moment of significant opportunity if we are prepared and ready to take that opportunity. For the last 8 years, those of us who talk about race and racism, whether it's folks of color at the community level who do this work every day with very little attention, very little fanfare, very little interest, frankly, paid by the vast majority of white Americans, or whether it's those of us who are white aspiring to be allies either at the community level or on this national level with this platform that I'm fortunate and privileged enough to have. For 8 years, all of us, irrespective of where we fall on that plot line, have been told what? We have been told repeatedly and by a lot of different voices across the political spectrum that we really didn't have to have this conversation any longer, that the issues about which we were animated really were no longer in evidence, and so therefore it was time for folks of color and their aspiring white allies to put away their concerns regarding racism, put away their concerns about white supremacy and white privilege, because after all, we all understood, did we not, that the election of a man of color proved that white supremacy had been crushed and forever eradicated. Well, I guess we know that that shit is over now. right? There's nothing like coming back down to reality, right? To start to understand why that narrative was wrong. Now, we all knew it was wrong. I think most of us in this room understood for the last 8 years why it was wrong, just like we understand that the election of women as heads of state in various countries around the world, not ours, but other countries, doesn't signify the end of patriarchy in Pakistan or Israel, India, Great Britain, Germany, Ireland, or other places where women have been presidents or premiers or prime ministers. But that was the message that we were sold. And now, for good or for bad, mostly for bad, but again, one must seek the silver lining in every really serious storm cloud, which you in Portland have significant experience with. Both clouds and I hope silver linings, looking for them there. We now have the opportunity to recognize, as the scab has been torn off from that sort of systemic denial of the last 8 years, that many people who were embedded in that denial, maybe not enough, and that's our job to make those numbers greater, but many people who were embedded in that denial now beginning to recognize the depths of their ignorance and naivete, now beginning to recognize that we are indeed a nation every bit as beset by white supremacy, every bit as beset by racial inequality as we were 9 years ago and 6 years ago, and in many ways 30 and even 40 years ago. In the last several months, and I know it's hard to imagine that this administration has only been in power for 60 days. It's a little difficult, not even 60 days, like less than 6 weeks, right? 6 weeks, so we're talking, 40 some odd days. It seems like it's been a lot longer than that, right? But I believe that people are starting to recognize in the midst of that moment that we've had for the last several weeks, this increase in overt hostility, overt hate crimes, disproportionately so against Muslim folk, against immigrant folk, particularly, of course, immigrants of color perceived to be undocumented, an uptick in hate crimes against LGBT folks, an uptick in hate crimes against Jewish folks generally, an increase in overt hostility against those deemed the other by those who are carrying the banner of Trumpism and the new white nationalism. We have these viral videos. It's very hard to miss. Certainly your children have seen them if you have not, right, of white folks having an incredibly difficult time coming to terms with the world, right? Freaking out in the Starbucks because the barista gets the latte order wrong, right? Which there's nothing like that to prove just how privileged you are, right? When a white person freaks out at the Starbucks because the black barista gets the order wrong and then goes off on a racial tirade, which happened, and that video went all around the web, right? You know that when you're complaining about that, when you perceive a messed up order at the coffee shop as evidence of oppression, as this particular individual did, you obviously haven't really dealt with much oppression. There's nothing like a viral video meltdown of a white man who feels trampled upon to actually acknowledge and demonstrate the depths of white male privilege to which he's become so obviously wedded, right? But these things are happening in greater numbers. We've seen an upsurge in white nationalist activity, both formal and at the highest levels of power. And my primary concern, I think it should be ours, is not white nationalism in the organizational sense. It's not Richard Spencer. It's not the folks like Matt Heimbach. I'm not saying that they're not a problem. They certainly are. And we have to be very aware of what they do and what they mean and what they say. But the bigger problem is an incipient, implicit, if not explicit, and sometimes it's rather explicit, white nationalism at the highest levels of power. The president's top advisor, someone who believes and has said very clearly that he believes white Western Christian civilization is locked in mortal to the death combat with Islam, right? And with foreign ideologies that seek to in some way destroy white Western Christian civilization, that at the highest levels of power. That's not coming from some neo-Nazi on Stormfront. It's coming from the president's most trusted personal advisor. At the very same time, it isn't just the level of rhetoric. We have a travel ban on Muslims because they are Muslim, not because they are dangerous. We know this for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that the 7 countries involved in the initial ban have not in fact provided any terrorist activity in this country against American citizens. They do, of course, happen to be places where the president doesn't have business, as opposed to other Muslim countries that were not involved in the ban. So this ban was not about danger. It was not about terrorism. It was about satiating the Islamophobic beliefs of a base of supporters for this president. It was about saying that something had been done against terrorism when really it was simply being done against one of the larger faith traditions on the planet. We have ICE raids, that is to say, Immigration and Customs Enforcement official raids being launched right now as I speak on persons perceived to be undocumented migrants. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, right? In the past, these raids were, at least in theory, aimed at those who were considered the greatest criminal offenders within the community. They often were not, by the way, and those raids under the Obama administration were often incredibly unjust as well. But now they're being launched against people who have committed no significant or serious crime, but are being targeted because they're easy targets, many of them dreamers, young people brought to this country by parents at the age of 1 or 2 or 3 years old. Their parents now being deported, hundreds in just the last several weeks, deported back to a country they hadn't been in 15 or 20 or 25 years, where they know nobody at all. They have no family or friends left in those communities from which they had originally fled or left to come to the United States, but they're being sent back. We have a Department of Homeland Security saying they are perfectly willing and prepared to separate children from their parents at the border, right? This is not Richard Spencer white nationalism. This is not David Duke white nationalism. This is white nationalism backed by the power of the state. This is considerably far more dangerous. David Duke is dangerous. Richard Spencer is dangerous. Matt Heimbach is dangerous. And all of those guys would be far more dangerous even than those in power now. But those in power now don't need neo-Nazism as a guiding principle ideology to engage in incipient white nationalism, because all of those things I mentioned are motivated by white nationalism, are they not? They're motivated by the long-standing conceit among millions of white Americans that this thing here is ours, that this country belongs to us, that it has always belonged to us, and anyone else who's here that doesn't qualify as white serves at our pleasure and only at our pleasure, and only so long as we wish to let them be here. Now, as James Baldwin told us 50 years ago, we didn't want to hear it then, just like we've never wanted to listen to anyone the likes of Baldwin. He said, what? America was never a white country. But those of us who had the luxury of believing that it was don't take change very well. And so as the demographics of the country shift and the cultural dynamics of the country shift and become increasingly multicultural, less obviously white and European, right? All of a sudden, folks who had become used to our own, one might even say addicted to our own sense of normalcy, right, are turning increasingly to a blatant form of white nationalism that tries to remind all that we were once a great nation and we shall be again. This is the heart impulse of fascism, this idea that the greatness of the society has been lost and squandered, destroyed by interlopers who do not belong. That is the seedbed of fascism in any culture. And it is certainly the seedbed in ours. When you make as your slogan the idea of making America great again, you suggest what? That we were once great and then something happened along the way that got us off track. What was that exactly? What year was it, one might ask, when things were so great? Of course, those to whom you ask the question never articulate an answer, because I think they know that whatever answer they might offer will make them sound like total assholes, right? So if you ask them the question, what are they going to tell you? Are they going to tell you, what, the 1950s? That might be what they're thinking. They don't want to openly articulate it most of the time, because everyone with any sense of history recognizes that that was not an era that was good for the vast majority of people in this country, certainly not folks of color as folks of color, certainly not women as women, certainly not LGBTQ folk as LGBTQ folks, certainly not the poor for whom the country has never really worked regardless of race, certainly not for people with disabilities, certainly not for people who were not Christian. The vast majority, in other words, of people in this country never actually experienced any of those former eras as wonderful, but it is a meme that works for an awful lot of people because we have this hagiographic, nostalgic view of our country's history, which is at the root, again, of this new white nationalism. We have at the same time a return to the rhetoric of what Jody David Armour, law professor, calls what, negrophobia, right? This long-standing trope of the fear of black crime and violence as a justification for all manner of reactionary policy, including crackdowns by police. We have a president who comes to power on the basis of what? Not just anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just anti-Muslim rhetoric, but anti-black rhetoric. The idea of law and order, which I beg to remind you has never been a neutral phraseology, because it has always been used by politicians to signify what? The need to crack down on those people in the interest of protecting the rest of us from them. That is the context within which Nixon used it. It is the context within which Reagan used it. It is the context within which Clinton used it as president. It is the context within which all politicians who have played upon that trope have used that terminology. And so we have a president who leverages that language even as violent crime rates, contrary to popular belief, are down by 50% since the early 1990s. So it's all rooted in lies and mythology, but that's what phobias are. They're not real. They're not based on actual experience. So this negrophobia, which has motivated white America for hundreds of years, going back to the Revolution, my God, this isn't new, right? I mean, Negrophobia was actually at the root of the revolution. We don't learn this because we're told that the revolution was about taxes on tea and other shit like that. It was about religious freedom and trying to get free from the king who was spending the colonist money in horrible ways and taxing them without representation. That's not why we had a revolution, and that's part of it. Right? But if you read the history, you also recognize that the elites in places like Virginia were mightily concerned because England was in the process of abolishing enslavement, right? And was in the process, and in fact, in one particular very famous court case, the Somerset case, you can look that up and read all about it if you'd like, right? There was an individual enslaved by one of the colonial elites who took his property to England with him, at which point his property ran away and claimed that he was now free, no longer in a slaveholding place, and the court agreed with him. So then you had these colonists, these slave owners back in the colony saying, my God, if they're going to uphold the rights of our property to no longer be enslaved, how long is it before they start doing that shit in Virginia? Right? How long is it before they start doing that in South Carolina? How long is it before they abolish slavery altogether? So part of the impulse for breaking away from the empire, right, breaking away from the crown was just as much to protect the property interests of white slave owners as anything else. It's certainly why they created a electoral college in 1787, right? See, if you don't understand where we come from, it's very hard to understand what the hell just happened, right? The only reason Donald Trump is president is because of the Electoral College. He loses by 3 million votes, right? So he wins because of an Electoral College. Why do we have an Electoral College? Again, we have mythology about why. Well, that was intended to prevent tyranny. Okay, that shit didn't work, obviously, so that ain't it, right? It's not that at all, right? The reason, again, was because you had the elites in very particular places, Virginia, South Carolina being first and foremost, but others as well that were highly dependent on slave labor, right? Coming to the convention in Philadelphia, and they were saying, listen, we can't have direct elections for president, and we can't even base it having the electors based solely on the overall population, because that will do an injustice to us in Virginia and South Carolina and other states that are dependent on slavery. Why? Well, because 40% of their populations weren't counted as human beings, or they were, but they were counted as 3/5. So you had 40% of your population discounted by 40%. Right? Which means if you're going to have elections based on the total number of people in your state determining your electors, you're going to be at a disadvantage because you're so dependent on these people you don't count as full people. So therefore, you want an electoral college which rigs the game, gives you more electors than you otherwise would have. In other words, the electoral college is in part, not entirely, but in large measure, the result of the desire by slaveholders to maintain their particular system of white domination and oppression. That is to say that Donald Trump is president today because of the wishes of white supremacists, whether in 2016 or 1787. So for those white folks who always ask questions like, why do we keep having to talk about slavery? Okay, that's why, because it just picked your president, right? It just picked your president. Yeah? So we have to understand these things and be very clear about them. This return to the rhetoric of Negrophobia, which has so long animated our history, is back again. We have a president who says he wants to do for the nation what was done in New York with stop and frisk, even though 94% of the people stopped over the course of the 11 years that were under review in the most recent court case. 94% of the time those individuals stopped had done nothing. They didn't even get a ticket or a citation for jaywalking or loitering, anything. Right? Only 6% of the time did they get any kind of a citation, and half of those got thrown out at court because there wasn't sufficient evidence, which means 97% of the time nothing had actually happened to justify the stop, the frisk, the search. But that's what we want to do for the country as a whole. The rhetoric, of course, was what? This is a way to get guns off the street. You know how many guns they found with stop and frisk racial profiling in New York City? They found guns less than 0.2% of the time. Actually, it was 0.1%. Over the course of the study that was involved in the court case that found stop and frisk unconstitutional, they looked at 4.5 million stops, right? And out of those 4.5 million stops, they found 4,500 guns. That's it, 0.1% of the time did they find weapons. This wasn't an anti-crime measure. This was a people control measure. This was a way of controlling certain people who were deemed as dangerous, right? To give the impression to other people that you're doing something about crime, but really you're not. They only found drugs about 1%, 1.2% of the time. That was the other rationale, right? Trying to get drugs off the street. But roughly 99% of the time, they found no drugs. Of course, if you really want to find drugs, just go anywhere in Portland, right? Walk into a store owned by a white dude, guarantee it, right? Right? Who had enough money to get a brick and mortar location for his weed, right? I love what you guys have done with weed in Oregon. It's hilarious, right? I mean, it's hilarious if you understand gentrification. White people have gentrified weed. How the hell do you gentrify weed? You know, I was here a few months ago. I'm driving down this road. I see all these signs. There's a sign of, Tommy Chong from Cheech and Chong, and he's advertising his own particular strain of weed. What the hell is that? And it said, the slogan, it says in come taste the elderberry essence of what the hell have white people done to weed? Why do you gotta have tasting notes with weed and shit? I don't understand. I don't need to know what kind of wine pairs with weed. I don't need to know what kind of cheese pairs with weed. Cheetos, but not cheese. I don't need to know any of that shit. And white people have gentrified weed, right? Meanwhile, black and brown folks still getting busted on the corner for selling it because they don't have an occupational license and their daddy doesn't have enough money to put up for a shop and they can't find any, capital, any sort of investor capital to start their weed shop, right? So we got white folks becoming multimillionaires selling the same shit black and brown folks still going to jail for. And the president and his Justice Department, right, say they want to start cracking down on that, but they're not going to come in and raid these shops. These shops are providing tax revenue for your state and for your city. They're not going to raid those shops in Colorado. They're not going to raid the shops here. They're going to crack down on folks on the curb. That's what they're going to do, right, in the name of law and order. Because the other folks are doing it, above board in a way that apparently, even though Jeff Sessions may not like it and Donald Trump may not like it, they're not likely to crack down on. Again, this law and order thing has always been a cover for negrophobia, as Jody David Armour calls it. It has always been a cover for oppression. The DOJ is saying they're going to cut back on consent decrees and lawsuits against police departments. They will do this, even though the evidence is overwhelmingly clear on a nationwide level that unarmed black folks continue to be 3 times as likely as unarmed white folks to be shot, even when posing no direct danger to law enforcement, when in places like Portland you have cases like Quantas Hayes who continue to die under mysterious, sketchy, very unclear circumstances with very little honesty coming forth from law enforcement about the conditions of that death and so many others. All of this, again, a form of white nationalism, a form of reminding the black and brown that you are here only because we let you be here, and that your freedom, your liberty, your citizenship, indeed maybe your life, will depend on the extent to which you remain clear about who will and should always remain dominant in this culture. As long as one accepts white dominance, at least presumably one will be safe from this new white nationalism. But if one challenges it, if one steps out of line or is perceived as stepping out of line, one will not. And of course, on top of all this, we have this layer of white victimology, not just the guy in the Starbucks who got the bad latte order, right? But a couple days ago, a survey of white Republicans found that overwhelming majority believe that anti-white discrimination is not only very common, but considerably more prevalent than discrimination against black and brown folks. This on top of a survey from about 4 or 5 years ago, which found that the majority of white folks generally, not just Republicans, but white Americans in general believe that to be true, right? Believe that anti-white bias is at least as big, if not a bigger problem than anti-black and brown bias. Now, one asks for evidence in moments like this, right? Because one would think, the history of anti-black racism is one that actually has an outcome, and it's visible, right? So when you screw black and brown folks over, you see it in the unemployment data, the poverty data, the wealth data, the graduation rate data, the incarceration rate data, the health outcome, infant mortality data, the lifespan and life expectancy data. But apparently, the thing about anti-white bias is it's so magical, right? It's so unicorn-like, right, that it actually continues to be a major problem without any real consequence. That's how evil it is, right? Because even with all of this anti-white bias, black folks are still twice as likely as white folks to be out of work. That is some tricky-ass anti-white bias right there. How does that work? That's just how bad it is. That's how secret it is. Black folks with the same level of education, college degrees, almost twice as likely as white folks with a college degree to be unemployed. So much for reverse discrimination, right? Latino folks with a college degree, about 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. So much for, Mexicans are taking all the jobs, which is always a funny thing, right? When people say, I got an email from a guy a couple years ago, a young man said black and brown folks are taking all the jobs. Really, all the jobs? All the jobs they're taking? This coming from a guy who one paragraph later tells me that black and brown folks are lazy. Okay, which is it? Because can't be both, right? If you took all the jobs, I'm fairly confident you ain't lazy. And if you are lazy, I'm thinking you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. I'm not sure how that worked, right? right? But this is the kind of pathology, right, that's involved with this notion of white victimhood. And it's, again, a narrative that isn't new, just like the negrophobia thing isn't new, right? White victimhood has been around for a very long time. The first time it was articulated openly that I know of was in 1883, and Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley, in his opinion that invalidated a number of post-emancipation civil rights laws, as he was striking those laws down, deeming them unconstitutional, the rhetoric that he used was the rhetoric of reverse discrimination. He didn't use that term, but this is what he said. He said that it was time for the Negro to stop being the special favorite of the law. This was in 1883, right? You black folks need to stop getting all these extra perks, you know, like the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank and this very minor modicum of reparation that was offered for a very short period of time and then yanked away by the Congress and by President Johnson, right? And by the withdrawal of federal troops after Johnson's administration from the South, right? That black folks should stop being the special favorite of the law, as Bradley said, and take their place among mere citizens. It's a very ironic formulation, considering that up until the point of emancipation and up until the 14th Amendment, the only citizens in the United States recognized were white. Because the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was the first law passed after the Constitution was ratified, said that all free whites and only free whites could be citizens. So what the hell is he talking about? Take your place among mere citizens. They're only one type until like a couple of years earlier, right? But that was the rhetoric of white victimhood. And we can look back at it now and it seems a little quaint and a little ridiculous and even a little pathetic, given the way in which white supremacy was so obviously entrenched. But understand, the danger of this rhetoric is that even though it's not that different from the way it was 100 years ago, right, and actually now over 100 years ago, the reality is that at this particular moment, more and more white folks are susceptible to it. Why? Because of that demographic shift. Because of the fact that within 30 years, half the country will be people of color, half will be white. So now all of a sudden, that rhetoric, even though I think the data still obviously suggests it's absurd when you see who has what, right, becomes more salient, becomes more believable, and therefore becomes more dangerous than it was perhaps 50 and 100 years ago, because there are that many more white folks who are susceptible to buying into it. The idea that, oh, the country is changing and people like me are losing our centrality to the narrative. We're losing our sense of normalcy, right? 100 years ago, that really wasn't a very strong argument for anyone, except for a handful of folks. But now it's a very powerful argument, this white victimology. There's also, I would point out, just before moving on to the What We Do piece, it's also a soft white nationalism, right? And it's only soft in relation to the harder version. I mean, what I've just shared with you is the harder version of white nationalism, the immigration roundups, the obvious rhetoric against those who were quote unquote different from the white Christian norm, right? But there's also a soft version, because if we take white nationalism as an idea that this space is ours and we have a right to it, and others don't unless we let them, then gentrification in places like Portland is a soft version of white nationalism, right? May not be quite the same, but it's a soft version that says, if we want to come into your neighborhood, the very same neighborhood that we avoided like the plague for 30 years, the very same neighborhood of which we wanted no part, the very same neighborhood we told our children to avoid, or that we were told as children to avoid, the very same neighborhoods that right now there are apps that people develop that actually tell you how to avoid them. But if we decide we want them because they're closer into the city and we can, you know, put in some hot yoga and a pottery studio. Nothing wrong with yoga or pottery now. I'm just saying that shit wasn't there before in most cases. And then folks come in. I mean, they're working class black and brown folks, love them some pottery, love them some hot yoga, but damn, that shit was not being offered 15 and 20 years ago. There was no Pilates studio. You didn't have 8 types of coffee. You know, they just didn't have that. Folks might have liked it, right? Could have come in and made that possible then. The city, the state, the federal government could have created the kind of economic development opportunities that would have allowed the people who were always there to get in on that on the ground floor. But in most places, not just Portland, all around the country, that isn't what happened. And this soft white nationalism has resulted in people being pushed out of the neighborhoods that they always lived in. They always tried to make better as other people come in. Now, I'm not indelibly opposed to the physical aspect of gentrification in the sense that people move back to the cities. I think it's good for folks to move back to the cities. I would prefer to people to engage in a cosmopolitan lifestyle and get to know one another and be around one another. I think there's positive to that. But the problem with gentrification is not the physical, it's the attitudinal. It's the attitude that you bring with your money and your body. If I come into the neighborhood with an attitude of joining the people already there and being part of their thing and following their lead and being accountable to their concerns and joining the struggles that they've always been involved in, whether that's concerns about police violence and misconduct, whether that's concerns about failing schools, whether that's concerns about housing access, affordability, whether that's a concern about a municipal waste dump or something along those lines, or lead paint in the buildings. If I come in and I join the existing struggle and subordinate my interest and needs in the short term to the interests, needs, and desires of the people already there, there's nothing wrong with that. That, unfortunately, is not the attitude that most bring. The attitude is, we're here, we're bringing our money, we're making this area nicer, and everybody else needs to get with our thing, right? Which is, on a soft level, what white folks did with this continent, right? Came in and said, we're going to make it this wonderful functional place where the indigenous, they just didn't do enough with it. So we're going to come in and we're going to make it nicer, ignoring the needs, the interests, the histories of indigenous peoples, right? And so it's very similar on a micro level and separated by many centuries from that initial colonial aspect, but still very similar in a lot of ways. So we have to resist both hard white nationalism, formal white nationalism, systemic white nationalism, and soft white nationalism, because it's all predicated on this notion of us and them, this idea that we belong and they, whoever they might be, do not. So what does one do with this then? And what must we do if we are to uproot that kind of thinking and the structures that follow from that kind of thinking? Number one is to understand those historic patterns. The biggest mistake we can make right now is to believe that all of this stuff is somehow unique to Trump and Trumpism, right? The idea that this is this unique moment. I know for a lot of white folks it seems that way, because for a lot of white folks, I don't, when the election happened, let's just be real honest, I don't think that that many black and brown folks were shocked at the idea that that could happen, right? If you saw the SNL skit a week after the election, right, with Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, like that was maybe the most apt, brilliantly conceived sketch that they've done on that show in a lot of time, because it was so on point. If you saw the sketch, there's 4 white folks or whatever, 3 white folks in their Brooklyn flat, naturally, and they had their one black friend, Dave Chappelle, was with them, and they're all watching the returns, right? And you recall, if you saw the sketch, there's all this stuff about, it's going to be a historic night. They just knew that Trump would lose and Secretary Clinton would win, right? It's going to be historic. And Dave Chappelle looks at him and says, well, it's going to be a long night, all right, It's like he knows something that they don't know, right, about America. And as the night goes on, the returns start to come in. They start to look at the screen of the TV that they're watching, and they're just appalled. They're like, oh my God, how could this happen? But don't give up yet. Vermont is still out, right? And Dave Chappelle says, oh, snap, Vermont with their 4 electoral college votes. Yeah, that shit's really gonna matter, right? And the white folks are still holding on to every little grasp, little thing of hope they have. And then Chris Rock comes in, right? And comes in and just as Hillary Clinton has lost and Trump has won, and the white folks are now just beside themselves, like, how could this happen? This is the most racist thing that's ever happened in America. And Chris Rock's like, really? The most racist thing that's ever happened, right? And the brilliance of this sketch is it demonstrates so clearly the different worlds in which large swaths of white America, not all, obviously, but large swaths of white America in which we live, as opposed to where a lot of black and brown folks live. The idea, right, that white folks could put someone like Donald Trump in power, and indeed it was, at the end of the day, white folks who did that, really doesn't shock too many people of color. They might have been surprised, because people of color read polls too, and they assume that stuff's going to go a certain way, because all the evidence seems to tell you it's going to go a certain way. But there's a difference between surprise and shock, right? Folks can be surprised and not shocked. And I gather that a lot of white folks still, here we are, a couple months later, we're still in the shock phase. Right? So part of responding to this is understanding this is not really a break with tradition, right? This is actually an extension of a tradition. The reason that's important is that if you begin to think that this is a unique moment in American history, you start thinking like you have no strategies to respond, right? It's like the idea like, what do we do now? Oh my God, what do we do? Whereas if you have a sense that this is just a maybe more extreme iteration of Monday, right? A more extreme iteration of last generation or the generation before that, then you don't get as hopeless, right? Because you realize, okay, wait a minute, right? When all this stuff's been going down for hundreds of years, people fashioned responses, and those responses did things that occasionally made things quite a bit better and beat back the most fascistic of the forces that were active at that particular time. So we don't have to lose hope in this moment, right? As if somehow all the momentum is on the other side, the reactionary side, and we don't have any lessons that we can draw from the past, because really none of this is new. Carol Anderson, who's a brilliant scholar at Emory University, just wrote a book. I highly recommend it, called White Rage. One of the best books on race that I've read in the last 5 to 10 years. And what she talks about in there, and it's a very short book, it's like maybe 200 pages long, very easy to read. She talks about how every period of American history that has seen advance for people of color, particularly for black folks, right, has been met with what some would call backlash. She refers to it as white rage, right? This idea that every advance has made whiteness and race salient, right? And confronted white folks with change that we oftentimes are not ready for. And so then we respond with this rage-filled approach. It happened after emancipation, right? When Reconstruction was imposed, and there was this rage response to it that brought us the Klan and brought us all types of overt terror in the South and outside of the South, right? The imposition of Jim Crow laws. In the 20s, when black folks began to move north and to the Midwest and all around the country during the Great Migration to escape the sharecropping economies of the South, looking for industrial jobs in factories, they were met with white rage, right? Overt riots, really pogroms of white violence against those black folks that were moving to places like St. Louis, all around the country, Chicago, Tulsa, all types of places, Omaha, lots of places that had these kinds of lynchings and overt riots, race riots, that were really just pogroms of violence against the black community. That was in response to the Great Migration. After desegregation in Brown v. Board, you had the white rage that led many Southern school systems to just shut down their schools altogether and create private white flight academies so as not to have to educate black children. Right? You also had overt violence, obviously, against some of those newly integrated schools and those who were advocating for them. In the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, you had the backlash against affirmative action, the backlash against busing for the purpose of integration or desegregation. You had the Reagan years and the war on drugs and the crackdown on crime and all of that law and order rhetoric. And in the wake of the Obama presidency, which one can argue is not really as big a leap forward for black folks as those other things, but symbolically, it certainly represents something that was meaningful and in the eyes of white folks was a huge break, right, with tradition. Whether or not it really advanced the ball forward significantly in terms of racial justice for African Americans is a different issue. Symbolically, it challenged white America with the idea of what we always considered to be normal, and so it too met almost instantly, right, with this white rage, the white rage of the Tea Party. I want my country back. Again, just the version of Make America Great Again that maybe came out first in 2009 and 2010, but still premised on the notion of white ownership. So all of this that we're seeing, and now with Trumpism, is really just a continuation of a process that has been going on literally for hundreds of years. The Negrophobia, clearly not new. The xenophobia, not new. It has marked American history from the beginning. And it, of course, was at one point aimed at the very people who now are considered part of the national experiment. It was aimed at Germans, right, originally. Then it was aimed at Russians. It was aimed at the Irish. It was aimed at Italians, right? It's been aimed at various groups throughout the course of our country's history, but in every moment it's been about dividing into the deserving and the undeserving. And importantly, what Donald Trump accomplished in this election was rooted in maybe the longest standing drama of American history when it comes to race, the ability to divide and conquer people from one another who actually have much in common. Because if you want to understand what just happened, in addition to the Electoral College piece that I talked about before, you really can't do much better to understand that if there's one sentence that explains American history with regard to race and class, one sentence that sums up who we have always been as a country when it comes to these issues, this is the sentence. The history of white America, or the history of America, period, is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Let me say it one more time. That the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown, right? Donald Trump didn't invent that, right? Donald Trump didn't invent that. He just knows how to market it better than most, right? But it's been going on for a long time. Go all the way back to the colonial period, the colonies, when there was no such thing as white people. I mean, there were people of European descent, but we didn't call ourselves white yet. That's not what we called ourselves in Europe. Europeans didn't think of ourselves as one big happy family, right? If you've studied European history, you know we didn't love each other, right? The English hated the Irish hated them right back. Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians, right? They were Mediterranean or North African peoples. The Germans hated everybody hated them, right? The history of Europe is really the history of killing each other and alternately trying to figure out who the witch is, right? That's sort of what we did for most of our history. Try to figure out who the witch is and then kill people. That was sort of the history of Europe. And so we get to the colonies. We're not white people yet, but all of a sudden we are. By the middle of the 1600s, late 1600s, this term starts to appear in law, in literature. Why? What is it that necessitated the creation of the white race in the middle of the 17th century? There has to be a reason for that. Why did we all of a sudden begin to take all of these disparate strands of Europe that didn't speak the same language, didn't have the same customs, didn't have the same cultures, did not like one another, and start to call them white? There's only one reason we did that, right? And the reason had to do with math. Very simply, the rich in the colonies, much as the rich today, very small percentage of the elite that own a disproportionate share of the stuff, they can do math, they can count, they can look around, they can see that when you take the African enslaved persons and European indentured servants one level above enslaved themselves, and even those who weren't indentured but were peasants, landless, non-owners, and you put them all together, they outnumber the rich 10 to 1, 15 to 1, 20 to 1, 30 to 1 in some communities. At some point, they worry that the poor are going to figure out the con and they're going to rise up and take rich folks' stuff. So as a way to diminish the possibility of class-based cross-color rebellion, you have to create a new team. Because if the only teams are the haves and the have-nots, eventually the have-nots are coming for you, right? So you have to create a new team. What's the team? The team is white people. Now we're going to take all these piss-poor Europeans who we can't stand and have been trampling for all of their lives, both in the old country and here, and we're going to put a uniform on them. Now, they're not going to be starting in the game. They're going to be at the end of the bench, but now they got the uniform, see? And what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple things. We're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that for you, white man, right? White woman, no more of that, right? We're going to let you enter into contracts, testify in court. We're going to let you vote, at least if you're male, right? And by the way, we're going to put those now called white men on the slave patrol to keep black people in line, right? We're going to give them a taste of power, not real wealth, not real power in any significant sense. We're going to give them a horse and a gun and a badge, by God. And we're going to trick these folks into believing that they're on our team and they got to keep these folks in line to protect our way of life. Our way of life? Who the hell's way of life you talking about? These piss poor, now called white people, are not sharing in the bounty of your wealth as rich folks, but that divide and conquer works because now I got a new enemy. Right? And so those rebellions that had begun to take place in places like Virginia, 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, there were others, right, begin to diminish because now these newly invented white people think that they got something in common with rich folks. Fast forward, that shit is still working by the mid to late 1800s. So in 1860, when the elite in the South, where I'm from, stand up and say proudly that they intend to break away from the Union and go to war if need be in order to preserve their property interest in human beings, right? Because that's what they said. See, we weren't ashamed of it 150 years ago. We just said that shit out loud because we didn't have the same recognition of how horrible that sounded. So folks were real clear. The elite back then, they didn't lie the way my people do now about what the Civil War was about, right? Because you come to my neck of the woods, you know, and we'll say things like, oh, it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. Yeah, what right do you think, Buttercup, that they were fighting for? They weren't fighting for the right of Georgia to tell Massachusetts the best way to smoke a pork butt. That was not the debate. Wasn't about how to do the perfect mint julep, all right? It was about the right to own other human beings, and they said so. The vice president of the Confederacy, who I take to be a relatively trustworthy source when it comes to motivation, right, said that the cornerstone of the Confederate government was the, quote, great truth that the Negro is not the equal to the white man. The cornerstone was white supremacy. And every state that broke away that issued a declaration of causes, there were only 5 that actually issued those declarations. Most of them just had these conventions and left. But the 5 that issued declarations of causes said very clearly why they did it. And in every single case, it was only and always about enslavement. But now here's the problem. If I'm a rich person and I want to break away from the Union to keep my slaves who I'm afraid the Union is going to make me give up, how the hell do I get poor people to go to war for that? Right? Because that's the divide and conquer piece. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war. Right? Whether in 1860 or today, rich people don't go to war. They get poor people to do that. Rich people don't go to war. They get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they don't have to go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, look that shit up on Google. You'll know. Right? You get a doctor to write a phony note saying that you can't go if you have enough money to do that. So here you are in the 1860s, rich folks admitting the only reason they want this thing to go down this way is so they can keep their property. But they don't intend to fight. They want poor people to fight for them. But why in the hell would you fight for rich people's stuff? How do you do that? How do you convince poor landless white folks who don't directly benefit, at least not in the same way materially, from the system of enslavement to go fight for you? Here's how you do it. You come to them and say, hey man, if they get free, they're going to take your job. They're going to take your job. They're going to take your, no fool. They already have your job. That's the point. right? Because if you got to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, if you got to charge $1 a day to work building that levee, if you got to charge $1 a day working in that blacksmith shop, or you got to charge $1 a day to work in the house cooking the food, cleaning everything, right? And they can get the black person to do it for nothing, for free, because they own them. Guess who got the job? Free got the job. Folks like free, right? Rich folks like free. They're not going to pay you $1 a day for something they can make that person do for nothing because they own them like they own an ottoman. Right? So in a sense, the system of slavery actually undercut the wage base of the vast majority of white working people, but they got suckered into believing that they needed to join forces with the elite. Why? Because of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, right? This idea that I might not have real wages, I might not have real benefits, I might be piss poor and have nothing, but at least I'm not black. At least I can consider myself to be above even the highest ranking black or brown person, right? Psychological wages, which I beg to remind you will not pay your bills, right? Which I beg to remind you will not pay a hospital bill, will not put your kid through college, will not allow you to start a business or do anything that you might want to do, won't allow you to feed yourself, but it'll allow you to feel superior. Divide and conquer, still working by the 1800s. It was working by the 1930s in the union movement. It was so concrete by then that you had labor leaders, white labor leaders that wouldn't integrate their union because they said if we integrate and bring black folks and Mexican folk and Chinese folk into the union, it'll reduce the professionalism of the craft. No, fool. It will double the size of your union, which might help when you go on strike, right? Because when you're on the strike line and you didn't bring those people of color into your union to work with you, and that means they're not on the strike line because you didn't want to work with them, so therefore they're not part of the union, guess who the boss is going to hire to replace your ass? They're going to hire the very people that you didn't want to work with. So in a sense, that racism, right, that divide and conquer actually allowed capital to run roughshod even more than they intended to do over labor. Right? Divide and conquer, still working with regard to immigration. That's what all this nonsense is. Telling working class people in this country that if we can just stop these people from coming over that border, only this border, never this border, only this border. We're not worried about crafty Canadians sneaking in to take advantage of our superior health care. Because that'd be weird, obviously. Right? If we can just stop people from crossing this, we can just build a wall, everything will be fine. That's what we keep telling these white working folks, and even to some extent black working folks, but especially white working folks, right? We can just build a wall and stop. Now, this is argued even though the net immigration numbers are an outflux in the last 10 years. There have been more people leaving than coming in, right? So if in fact having fewer people coming in were the thing that corresponded with better manufacturing jobs and heavy industry jobs, the kind that we're told are being lost as a result of immigration, if that were really true, then we would have seen a significant spike in those jobs for the very people who still don't have them because there's been a net outflux of immigrants. Obviously, something else must be going on that's got nothing to do with brown people. This idea you can build a wall and jobs come back, is that how you think capitalism works? The hell, you think that's how capitalism works? You think capitalists are sitting around going, holy shit, I hope they don't figure out the whole wall thing because, if they figure out just to build a wall, I'm going to have to give everybody a raise, and I don't want to do that, right? That's not how capitalism works. Capitalism works on the principle that I can always move my money wherever the hell I want. I will always be able to move my capital across borders. And I know some people, the president apparently thinks that he can stop capital flight with a mean tweet, right? But I got news for you. Corporate executives, capitalists don't give a damn about your tweeting habits. You can't just tweet at a CEO like, don't you dare move those jobs overseas. They don't give a shit. They got millions of dollars on the line. You think they're going to be like, well, I was going to move to Sri Lanka and take advantage of $40 billion in additional profits, but the president says I shouldn't, so I guess I'll stay here and go broke. No, that's not what they're going to do. Capital will always be mobile. Goods will always be mobile in a global economy. If you allow capital to be mobile and you allow goods to be mobile, but you chain labor to its country of origin, you have tilted the game inherently in favor of capital and against working people by definition, and not only those south of the border, but those north of the border as well, who would be better off to have more workers fighting for better wages and better working conditions for all working people throughout the hemisphere and the planet, right? But this divide and conquer works, and we actually believe if we just build that wall, those jobs are going to come back, ignoring for a moment that the reason most of those heavy industry jobs that have been lost is because of two things that the wall can't touch. One is mechanization, right? And the other is efficiency of workers. Workers are actually more efficient now than they were when their grandparents did the same job. So you get all these white folks that are pissed about losing their coal mining jobs. They want, I want to work in the coal mine like my granddaddy did. A couple of reasons why you can't. And it's got nothing to do with hippies, right? Because that's the argument. Well, it's all the environmental regulations is why we don't have coal. No, it's not. It's because rich coal mine owners discovered that they could get more coal by blowing the tops off of mountains, right? Which doesn't take nearly as many workers to do as it is lowering all these folks or entering them into the mountain the way you would have done it 30 years ago, 50 years ago. So the only way you're going to get those jobs back, even assuming that they would be functional jobs that we want to come back, right, where folks are dying before they're 60 years old because of occupational safety and health violations and inadequate health care coverage, and not to mention the ecological consequences of the jobs. But even if you wanted those jobs back, the reason you can't have them is you're better at your job than your granddaddy was. The only way they're going to come back is if you actually are as inefficient as he was, and if you get rid of the mechanization that made it possible for coal to even exist as a functional form of energy production. None of those jobs are coming back just because we want them to, just because we nostalgize the old days, and certainly not because we build a wall or get rid of certain regulations or blame other people for problems that they didn't cause. It's all based in that notion of divide and conquer. So that's number one. We have to understand the historic patterns. Secondly, we have to switch our lenses up. We have to be able to do this on a really regular basis. The reason so much angst in this country is felt over things like policing, over things like immigration, is because we're operating on a faulty lens, right? It wouldn't be that hard for us to have these conversations in a productive way and to move in a more productive direction if the white lens was not so utterly distorted by our experience relative to the experience of people of color. The reason that so many white folks can't get their heads around things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for police accountability is because our experience with law enforcement is so fundamentally different by and large than the experience of peoples of color. If we had a different lens, if we understood the lens that black and brown folks have, it doesn't mean that we would understand entirely the experience, because one can't understand it unless one lives it. Right? But if we don't understand that experience, how can we have a productive conversation? Black and brown folks know that modern law enforcement traces from those slave patrols I mentioned before. Black and brown folks know that it's been law enforcement at every step of American history that has been the enforcing arm of racism and injustice. That's not calling every cop a racist. That's not even saying that most cops are racist. It's saying that the culture of policing historically has been one that has maintained white supremacy. That's not an arguable position. There's no rebuttal to what I just said. It's simply fact, because if the bulk of American history has been the history of white supremacy and somebody had to enforce that shit, who do you think did it? Cops did it. They're the ones that enforced the slave codes. They're the ones that enforced the black codes after slavery was abolished. They're the ones that enforced segregation. They're the ones that pulled protesters off of sit-in stools at the Woolworths and at other stores all throughout the South. They're the ones that conspired in those lynchings by releasing people into the mob and watching as lynchers killed them. They're the ones who enforced the war on drugs. They're the ones that killed 27 members of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and early 70s, as well as members of the American Indian movement. They are the ones who did that. That doesn't mean that every cop is guilty of those particular actions, but it means that we got to understand black and brown skepticism when it comes to law enforcement and cynicism, because it has been come by honestly, right? If that isn't your experience, though, it doesn't make sense. That's why white folks can hear Black Lives Matter and, sort of flip out. Well, but what about me? My life matters. All lives matter, don't they? Yes, precious, yes. Yes, they do. Yeah. I know. You don't have to tell me. I have 2 teenage daughters. They're both white. That's what happens when white people make babies. They are white, and I know that their lives matter. The difference is the cops also know it. The employers know it. The bankers know it. The teachers know it. No one questions it. You only have to specify that which is forgotten, right? You only have to specify that which gets left out. But if you don't understand, because you've never learned the history, right, of how much black lives were discounted by law enforcement, and by teachers, and by bankers, and by employees. If you don't understand the way in which black lives have not mattered historically to those in power, then when you all of a sudden hear people asserting that they do, it seems outrageous. Because your assumption is, well, of course they matter, but they always have. But they always haven't. That's the point. America has a long history, particularly white America, a long history of saying all and not meaning it. All right? We didn't. Thomas Jefferson, who I gather is one of white people's favorite white people, Thomas Jefferson said, right, his declaration, his words, he says, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said all, but the day he wrote those words down, he owned over 275 other human beings, so he couldn't possibly have meant it, right? When the Pledge of Allegiance was first written in the 1880s, and then it went through other iterations in the 20s and all the way up until 1954, the height of the McCarthy era, right? But even the version in the 1880s had that last line, never really changed, right? With liberty and justice for all. There's that word again, all. But I dare say that in the 1880s, when that word was written in there, it didn't mean it. The country certainly wasn't a place where there was liberty and justice for all, nor was it in the 1920s, nor was it in the 1950s. Even if you're one of those people who believes we have such liberty and justice for all today, which I think is nonsensical, but at least, whatever, you certainly can't believe it was true in the 50s or the 20s or the 1880s, but we said it. So that's why we have to have a different lens, because once we put on the lens that black and brown folks by necessity have to look through, right? It doesn't mean that we come to perfect knowledge, but it does change the conversation considerably when we take off our lenses, which after all are just the result of our experience. I'm not saying that white folks should feel bad about the lenses that we have. I understand why we have them. There's a reason we don't know this stuff, because it hasn't been taught, right? It's not just that it's been kept from black and brown folks who've managed to learn it anyway, right? It's been kept from us. They didn't teach me this stuff. They didn't teach me this stuff in AP history, and that's the history for the smart people. That's what they say. We didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about the history of law enforcement misconduct. We didn't talk about the history of white supremacy outside of a certain couple of, high point moments in American history with regard to that. So we have to be prepared to put on a different lens. Same thing with immigration. The only reason we have such angst over immigration is because we've created a fiction, those of us who are white. The fiction says that our people came for freedom. Those people are just coming for stuff, right? Coming to take advantage. Really? Is that what you think our people came for? It's like when Donald Trump said, Mexico's not sending their best. All right, you think England sent their best? I mean, the best didn't get on the boat. You got that? Like, the best never leave where they are. Why the hell would the winners leave? The winners don't get on the boat. The winners are winning. They stay the hell put, right? The only ones who leave are the losers by definition. There's no shame in that. But once we concoct this fictional narrative that says, well, our people came over on the Mayflower looking for liberty. All right, if you knew who was on the Mayflower, you might not brag about that shit so much. You know who wasn't? The king. The king wasn't on that damn boat. Nobody the king particularly liked or wanted to keep around was on that boat. The winners stayed where they were. The losers left. It's always been the case. People don't like to move their stuff. People don't do that just for fun. My family and I moved a few years ago 3 blocks. It damn near killed me. I hated it. I said, I'm never moving again. 3 blocks. I'm like, I'm done. Don't ever ask me to move again, ever. I'm going to stay right here until I die, right? People don't like to leave. You know who'd really like to not, if there's one group of people that would most like, right, for Mexican people to stay in Mexico, you know who it is? Mexicans. They would love to not have to leave. People would love to not have to leave Honduras or El Salvador or Sri Lanka or Vietnam or anywhere on the planet, pick up everything they know, everything they've been, and move to a different place. The idea that people do that to take advantage flies in the face of all human history. People rarely leave where they're from unless they have no choice. But if we don't understand that, because we've created this fictional narrative, we can't see ourselves in them, we can't see them in us, and thus our problem. So we have to shift our lens. The next thing is we have to tell a new story. Because if we don't, this is the thing I think sometimes the left doesn't get. Those of us on the left, we don't always understand the value of a meta-narrative, okay? So we tend to come at issues a little bit like the debate team, right? And, I was a competitive debater, so, I enjoy that exercise. It's nice as an intellectual conceit. But when you come at issues like the debate team and the other side comes at issues like a PR firm, guess who wins, right? The PR firm wins. That PR firms make all these commercials that convince us to buy shit we don't need, right? That's what they do at the Super Bowl. You know how much money they spend on Super Bowl advertising, right? To say nothing of year-round advertising. Hundreds of millions, really billions of dollars over several years. The only reason they do that is because they know that if they craft a catchy enough narrative that pushes all the right emotional buttons as a consumer, right? That you need this product to be fully American. This is the product that's going to get your teeth really, really white. This is the product this is the best, tablet to have, the best phone to have, the best shoes to have, the best toilet paper to wipe your ass with. This is, and they convince us of this, and people get paid a lot of money for it, and we sit around debating facts and figures, which is interesting, but the research from the field of brain science says that isn't really what wins the day. It's the larger narrative. It's a values discussion. right? And I don't think we've really on the left often engaged this because we're so focused on the like in the street moment of activism, which is very important. Please do not misunderstand. But none of that activism that we look back on wistfully, whether it's the civil rights struggle, whether it's the abolitionist struggle, whether it's the labor movement struggle, none of that stuff worked just because there were people in the street raising hell. And all of a sudden, the powers that be were like, oh my God, you're totally right. We were totally wrong. Let's change our direction. That's not what happened. There was always a meta-narrative that was in play with the civil rights struggle, with the labor movement struggle. And that meta-narrative was about what kind of society do we want to be, right? What are our obligations to one another? And the other side has made it very clear that they don't believe we have obligations to one another. So we don't have an obligation to stop police violence. We just have an obligation to not be criminals and to crack down on those who are. We don't have an obligation to provide health care. We just have an obligation to make it where people can make a choice to live or die. And if you can afford it, you can afford it. And if not, too bad. We don't have an obligation to guarantee housing or food as a human right to which people are entitled, right? These are just other commodities that you can either get or not get. We've got to tell a better story at the level of meta-narrative and confront people in a values-based debate, not just a materialistic debate, not just a numbers and data and quantitative debate, right? But a qualitative discussion about the kind of place that we want to be, right? Because the only way that this cruelty that's so embedded in our culture, cruelty toward people of color, cruelty toward the poor of all colors, continues, and cruelty toward women as women continues. You know why it happens? It's because the meta-narrative is about the deserving and the undeserving. That's the meta-narrative that the other side has crafted, right? That there are some who deserve and some who don't. And that's really always been the right-left divide. The right will tell you, conservatives will tell you that conservatism is about small government versus big government. That's bullshit. That's not what conservatives are about. Right? Because they believe in big government as long as it's about snooping on what you do in your private life sexually, or if it's about controlling women's bodies or bombing the hell out of somebody, right? Or imposing your will abroad. They love big government when it comes to subsidizing corporations all around the planet. They have no problem with big government when it comes to those things, or spying on you, or unleashing the police to crack heads in their community under the guise of law and order, or mass incarceration. Most of them don't complain about that. That's huge government. Right? And by the same token, people on the left are not all about big government. People on the left would like less of that kind of thing when it comes to snooping and interrogation and law enforcement crackdowns. So it isn't about the size of government. The difference between right and left is that the right believes in traditional lines of authority, traditional lines of hierarchy, the idea that the winners deserve to win because they're better people, and the losers deserve to lose because they're not, because if they weren't worse people, they'd be winning. That's the fundamental right-left divide, right? The idea that men are on top because they ought to be on top, and white folks are on top because they ought to be on top, and the rich deserve what they deserve. That's why they're rich. That's the fundamental divide. It's about maintaining traditional lines of hierarchy. And this has been true since the beginning of the terms right and left, right? Because these terms come out of revolutionary France. Those on the right side of the legislative body were those who defended the monarchy and defended royalism, and those on the left were in favor of the revolution and a move toward equality and liberty and fraternity, right? So that's always been the divide. But those on the right are winning this meta-narrative debate while we sit around and talk about policy details, or we sit around and talk about abstract revolutions without talking about the meta-narrative that allows people to even hear what we're talking about. What do I mean by this? Well, here's what I mean. And I think about this not as a scholar, an activist, or writer. I think about it as a dad. So a couple years ago, I'm driving my kids to dance. They're both dancers. They were dancing in a studio where they were both members of the dance company downtown in Nashville. We're driving from school to the studio. It's about an 8-minute drive. We get stopped at a red light in the middle of public housing, right? And the 10-year-old at the time looks around. We made this drive every day for, I don't know, like a year at that point, or a year and a half. And I'm sure she had noticed the demographic of the neighborhood before, but that day she looks around and she says, "Daddy, why is it everyone in this neighborhood is black?" It's a damn good question, right? It's a sociological inquiry. It's an anthropological question. And it's one that, thank God, I know the answer to. Because when you're a parent, right, there are all those times your kids ask you stuff and you're like, oh, shit, I don't know, right? Like if she'd asked me how electricity works, I'd been like, Google it, don't know. But she asked me a question about race and demographics, so I understood I had the answer, right? And so I then proceed to give her this answer, right? Actually, my older daughter, the 12-year-old, jumped in because that's what older siblings do. I didn't know this. I was an only child. But when a younger child asks a question in the presence of the parent and the older sibling is also there, inevitably the older sibling will jump in to offer the answer just to show off to the parent how much they know. I didn't know this was a thing. Now I do. The older sibling jumps in and says redlining, which was scary accurate, by the way. I was like, holy shit, do I talk in my sleep? Is this transmitted genetically? Are you reading my books? Like, you're 12. Like, what are you? How do you know that, right? And the 10-year-old was like, I don't really know what that means. And I said, yeah, I don't think the 12-year-old does either, but it's a really good guess. She's going to do well on the SAT with that kind of guesswork, right? But she was right in large measure, right? The history of how neighborhoods came to look the way they look is a history of discrimination, right? Whether it was formal redlining, drawing a red line around black neighborhoods and anyone within the line wasn't getting a loan, which was typical formal practice for generations affecting black and brown peoples, or whether it's more subtle forms of housing discrimination, which the research says happen 2 to 3 million times still. The history of discrimination, right, is what explains it. But here's the important reason I'm telling you this story. If I don't know the predicate to what she's seeing, if I don't know the preface, if I don't know what came before, I can't answer her question, but she'll keep wondering it, won't she? And as she wonders it, what is the default position to which she will ultimately come? The only default position you can come to if you don't know the answer and nobody's there to give it to you, whether it's a parent or a teacher or someone, a colleague, right, is the default position of American society. It's the creation myth of America, right? It's our fundamental secular gospel. It's Genesis 1:1 of American ideology. And what is Genesis 1:1 of American ideology? It's the idea that anybody can make it if they just try hard enough, and if they didn't make it, it's their own damn fault. Right? That notion of meritocracy, rugged individualism. If you believe that, right, and then you look around and you see this kind of disparity, not just in terms of who lives where, but also in terms of the quality of the infrastructure of this neighborhood versus that neighborhood. So it's not just that black folks live here and white folks live here, it's that these folks are disproportionately poor and these folks are not. If you default to the idea that everywhere you end up is all about you, you come to conclusions that are fundamentally racist by definition, by default, and without any bigotry intended. Right? This is how racism is transmitted without intent. This is how sexism is transmitted without intent, because if you have men disproportionately here and women here, then it becomes logical to assume women just don't work as hard, don't have the same skills. If you see rich here and poor here, it becomes rational, doesn't it? To believe that, well, I guess the rich are there because they're just better and the poor are there because they're not. So all of these isms become easy to justify and rationalize unless you have this historical memory and unless you're telling a different story about how we got from point A to point B. And when I say how we got, I mean how you personally did. Because the thing that keeps this notion of rugged individualism in place is that none of us want to really speak out against it nearly enough. Because we want to believe that we've earned what we have. We really do. Even nice liberals want to believe that. We really do. We're very wedded to it. And I know why, right? Because it makes us feel like we're in charge of our lives. I get it. I get the allure. I get the psychological hook of meritocracy, right? It allows us to believe that if we just work a little harder, we might be struggling right now, but we won't be if we just try a little harder, right? The problem with that mentality is, A, we all know it's not really true because we all know people who've worked hard and got nothing. We all know people that were born on third base, think they hit a triple, never had to work hard at all. Right? There are 37 people in this country that have the same collective net worth as the bottom half of all Americans, 165 million people versus 37. I think we all know that there aren't really 37 people who are that much smarter and work that much harder. We know it's not true, but we cling to it because it gives us hope. It gives us hope that if we just try harder, our lives can get better. But the danger is that that mentality allows us to then look down on those who are struggling. And here's the real kicker, why this is so important for white folks to break from. It's actually a dagger pointed at our own heart, whether we realize it or not. Because all these white folks that just voted for Trump, right, because they say he's going to bring the jobs back, he's going to make America great again, he's going to get me my coal mining job, he's going to fix the Rust Belt, bring back all those assembly lines. Why are these folks having such a hard time? Well, on the one hand, it's hard to be out of work, isn't it, and watch your town crumbling and dying. I get that. That's got to be scary as hell. Right? It's hard to be out of work for 20 weeks, for 50 weeks. Some people during the recession, 99 weeks of unemployment, right? And the government cutting the benefits that they can receive. So I can imagine it's got to be scary. But here's the thing, right? Black and brown folks, that wasn't new for them. 26 weeks of unemployment, 52 weeks of unemployment, struggling to pay your bills. Black and brown folks have gotten used to that over a lifetime of oppression. It's not to dismiss or diminish the hardship that white folks are experiencing. It is to make a point about the dangers of privilege. See, because it was privilege that historically always boosted white people and made it where we weren't ready for a global economic shift. We weren't ready when the economy shifted underneath our feet like wet sand. We weren't ready for a demographic change. People who are the marginalized are always ready for change because they have to be. They have to learn to adapt. They have to learn to hustle. They have to learn how to overcome and how to persevere. If you're the dominant group, you've never had to do that. And all of a sudden, when things change, you're the one that's not ready, right? So in a sense, the more we embrace that notion of rugged individualism, the more we embrace that idea that wherever you end up is all about you,
which historically has allowed us to look down on black folks and look down on brown folks and look down on poor folks, including our own poor, who were white, ultimately that works against us because we have this expectationalism that's way up here. We expect that as long as we work hard, play by the rules, everything will be right. But in a global economy, that's not true. In a global economy, we can work our ass off and we can work our fingers to the bone and still have nothing. Black and brown folks always knew that. Maybe we should have listened to them. Maybe white America needed to learn from people of color who have always understood that that was a con, that that was a lie, that the promise of America was not real for millions of people. If we had understood that, then we wouldn't be so caught off guard right now. See, there's a reason that the areas with the highest rate of Donald Trump support were the areas with the highest rates of opioid addiction. You've seen these stories, right? Right, where the opioid crisis, right, which is interesting how we refer to it that way with all kinds of sympathy. All these white folks in small towns getting hooked on oxy and getting hooked on heroin, and now we want treatment and education, not prison, right? Which, of course, is a nice forbearance we should have had during the crack crisis or the heroin crisis of the 1970s that was disproportionately hitting black and brown communities. But here's my point in bringing it up. The reason I bring it up is not, by the way, to say that you have to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not my argument. My argument is, although that's an interesting sociological inquiry that many of y'all who are scholars might want to engage, that's not my point. My point is, what is an opiate, right? An opiate is a drug that pharmacologically is intended to do one thing: block pain receptors. That's what it does. It doesn't fix your problem, but it blocks the pain emanating from the problem. If you have a crushed disc, you need surgery to repair that, but they might put you on opiates until you can get the surgery, right? So as to deal with the pain. You have cancer, they might put you on opiates. It's not going to solve your problem, but it'll dull the pain. In a way, Donald Trump is a walking, talking opiate who walks into communities and says, I can take away your pain, and more importantly, I can tell you where it's coming from, and you can blame somebody else. And so this addiction that you have to your own sense of normalcy and superiority is not unhealthy. My goodness, no, it's not your fault, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a dagger pointed even at our heart because it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't bring jobs back. It doesn't boost wages. It doesn't prepare people to be able to pay for their health care bills or anything else. So this meta-narrative of deserving and undeserving is what we have to challenge. This idea that people end up where they are because of their own effort is the most dangerous underlying ideology. And here's the really unfortunate thing. It is the central guiding principle of the country, which is to say that if we're going to undermine racism and the class system and patriarchy and any of these other systems of inequality, we have to actually challenge the most fundamental organizing tenet of the culture, which is not an easy task. It's like standing up in the second row of a church after the Sunday service and announcing that God doesn't exist, right? This is some hard shit, but that's what has to happen. Because at the level of meta-narrative, that other side is winning. That other side is the one that's saying what? We don't have to have guaranteed health care. It doesn't matter because health care is just a commodity. If you can afford it, great, right? But you saw the other day Jason Chaffetz from Utah, the congressman, that basically said this thing about iPhones, right? Well, you just have to choose iPhone or healthcare. And everybody went sort of nuts saying things like, doesn't he know an iPhone, even if it's all tricked out, is only $700? Healthcare is thousands of dollars. Yes, he knows that. You're missing the point. The idea that this is just some flub or ignorant comment, right? This is not an ignorant comment. He's perfectly aware that the cost of healthcare is more than the cost of an iPhone, but this is about meta-narrative. This is about symbolic politics. This is about reminding people that they're deserving and undeserving and pushing those buttons of resentment that say, oh yeah, all these people that don't have healthcare educations, it's because they got all these luxuries like cell phones and refrigerators and microwaves and cars and televisions, right? The Heritage Foundation puts out a report every couple of years that says that. Well, the poor aren't really poor. 97% have a fridge. What the hell kind of argument is that? What the hell are poor people supposed to do to keep their food from spoiling? Like, I mean, this is what kind of argument? Whether the poor today are richer than the poor in 1778. Well, yes. And Thomas Jefferson had to piss in a chamber pot and in an outhouse, but that doesn't mean that the poor today are better off than Thomas Jefferson. What kind of argument is that? But it's an argument that works at the level of symbolism. It's an argument that works at the level of the meta-narrative, which is intended to reinforce the idea of the good people and the bad people. We must challenge that by insisting that this debate, whether it's about policing, whether it's about jobs, whether it's about healthcare, whether it's about education, is really about the kind of society we want to be. What are our obligations to one another? And we have to be doing that in a way that, I think that meta-narrative works with people because honestly, if you think about the way that we treat within our own families, right? Very few parents would ever say to their kids, well, you didn't do your chores, you didn't take out the garbage like I asked, you didn't study real hard for that test, so you didn't do real well. As a result, if you fall down the steps and break your leg, I'm not going to take you to the doctor, right? We would not treat healthcare as a commodity that you had to earn access to within our families. I mean, there might be some particularly cruel parents who would do this, but very few, and they would probably deserve to have their children taken from them in a perfect world, right? You wouldn't say to your kids, well, you got a C on that test, so we're not going to feed you until you get your grades up. Now, you might do that with luxuries, right? So you might say to your kid, you can't go to your friend's house to spend the night or whatever. You can't go out and play. You can't get on your screen, and do whatever. You can't watch television, whatever. You could take away luxuries because they were screwing around, not doing what they're supposed to do or didn't do what you asked them to do. That's the difference between a luxury and a necessity, right? I think we've got to be having a very different conversation that insists that these things like healthcare, like food, like shelter, these are not luxuries. These are not things that one should commoditize like big screen televisions and iPhones and that's the real debate. It's not about whether healthcare is more expensive than an iPhone. It's about why the hell is the issue of getting healthcare about expense at all? Why is the issue about food about whether you can afford to buy any or not? Why is the debate about housing and shelter, whether or not you can actually afford the rent? These are things that without which you cannot live, let alone exercise self-determination and autonomy. We've got to have a conversation that says certain things are non-negotiable. And those things include food, shelter, and medicine. Beyond that, we might have various inequalities and disparities, but for God's sake, if we can't craft a society that guarantees at least that, we'll continue to be at one another's throats, right? Because we can't stop fighting each other over the basic necessities like that as long as we continue to define them not as necessities, but as luxuries. We'll continue to beat each other up, so I make sure I've got more than you, or you make sure you've got more than me. This is a symbolic politic. We've got to change our lens. We've got to tell a new story, and we've got to be prepared to put ourselves on the line. Because in the next several months, we're going to have opportunities to do that. We're going to have to be the ones who are providing sanctuary to those undocumented folks who are being attacked and being sent out of this country. That means in our own houses of worship. It means in our own nonprofit institutions. It means in our own homes. We're going to have to be the ones who put ourselves on the line when some act of intolerance takes place in our presence, whether it's at that Starbucks or on an airplane or wherever the hell else it is. We're the ones who are going to have to get up and leave that airplane when that Muslim couple is escorted off because there's a presumption that they're dangerous. We're going to have to say that we're leaving as well. We're going to have to be prepared to stand up and do that, because the only way that this system of white nationalism takes even greater root than it already has is if those of us who are white remain silent in the face of it and give our assent to it. The more that we stand up, the more that we act in solidarity with our black and brown brothers and sisters, the more opportunity we'll have to create a very different narrative and a very different society. So take heart in the fact that this is not new. This is a very old struggle, and we can learn from those who have fought this struggle in the past. Back in December, I went to Washington right after the election, and I was there for an event. I had the opportunity to go to the newly opened history museum, the African American History and Culture Museum, which if you have a chance to go to it, I highly recommend it. You certainly should. It's one of the finest museums that I've ever been in, anywhere for any purpose. And as you go in, you're just sort of taken by it. I don't know if you know the way it's laid out, but you go 10 stories down in the ground. They dug a huge hole, goes 10 stories deep. You start down there at the middle passage of enslavement. You come up every level until you're finally at the place where the light comes in, and it's meant to symbolize the rise of black folks against all systems of oppression and the perseverance of the black community. So it's very powerful just on a symbolic level. What's fascinating, though, when you come through, right, you're reminded of so much. And it was a perfect time for me to go there because, the museum is literally like 500 yards from the White House. Okay, so there's the Washington Monument and the White House, and it's sort of tucked away on the side, but in between those. So it's right there, right? And Donald Trump at that point had won. He hadn't been sworn in yet, but he'd won. And here I am, I'm walking through. There's at one point where you come to a statue of Thomas Jefferson, and it's sort of bathed in darkness and shadows, right? And up on the wall, this big stone wall, granite wall, there are carved the words of the Declaration, all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're contrasted, right, this sort of quote with what you know about Thomas Jefferson. And in between Jefferson, the figure of Jefferson, and the wall with these words, there are these boxes that are stacked up. And at first you don't know what they are because they too were bathed and cloaked in darkness and shadows. You walk up to the boxes, you see they have names on them, right? And each of these names, which is really these boxes, are meant to symbolize bricks. And each of the bricks has a name on it. And the names, you come to find out if you didn't already know, are the names of the human beings that Thomas Jefferson owned at the moment that he wrote those words, right? So you have this contrast between the words that have always animated this country and the reality that's always gotten in the way. And what you're reminded of, both at that exhibit and all throughout the museum, is how people, in spite of the contradiction, and in spite of the hypocrisy, and in spite of the inconsistency, overcame that system and imposed abolition on a country that certainly didn't want it at the time, right? You're reminded of how even the most powerful individuals in human history can be brought low by the collective action of the people, right? You continue to walk through and you see Emmett Till's casket, original casket in the museum, and you see Nat Turner's Bible, and you see the axe handle that former Georgia Governor Lester Maddox used to wield in his restaurant whenever black folks would try to come in. He would chase them out with an axe handle. And you see the footage from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and you see the footage from Birmingham in 1963. And what it reminds you of in that moment, right, is that black and brown peoples have overcome far bigger and far badder than Donald John Trump. And that people of color have always managed to overcome even far greater monsters than this. And so at the end of the day, we have to be concerned, we have to be worried, but there's no cause for panic, because the same trajectory forward is the trajectory forward that folks of color have always been on. And we who are white and intend to be allies need simply to join them in the doing of it, the following of them in the doing of it, and stop the questioning of how they do it. Because until we are prepared to risk as much as they risk every single day, we're in no position to really lecture them on strategy. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. So I'll take a few questions for those who can stick around, and then I do have copies of Under the Affluence, which was the last book that I published a year and a half ago. I'll have those in the back for those who might want those. But we'll take some questions first. I'll let folks who have to leave hop out. Thank you for coming and sticking around so long. If you have a question, I don't think we've got mics on the floor, but if you have a nice loud voice and want to ask one, feel free to do that if you are interested. And I will call on you and we'll take it from there. If folks just want to raise their hand, I can call on you. Hey, how are you? Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So we do have a mic, actually, for folks who would like to ask a question. If you feel that your voice is not booming enough, we can bring you a microphone, or if you don't want to use one, you don't have to. I know some people don't like talking on the mic. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My name is Kofi Desu. I do training on racial equity. And many times when I share the history of the US government and Oregon government, some white people come and tell me that I make them feel guilty.
Right.
So I would like to hear from you, what will be your response?
Well,
those people who feel guilty.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I always find it interesting when folks say they feel guilt over stuff that they then also insist they didn't do. Right? Because guilt is something you ought to feel for the stuff you actually have done. So if you're feeling guilty and yet you swear you didn't do nothing to nobody, I always find that interesting, and I want to understand what that's about. Because, you know, if you were to ask me, you know, if there's a serial killer on the loose and you ask me where I was last Wednesday when someone was killed, and I know where I was and I know I didn't do it, I don't really trip, you know? I don't get all defensive. There's an old saying in this work, why are you getting so defensive if what I'm saying doesn't apply to you, right? So that's first. But really the issue is that guilt is the luxury of people. Actually, I'm going to restate that. I'm going to say that this isn't about who's guilty for having created this system the way it is. No one alive today is directly guilty for having created that system because, as I said, and I'm sure if you're tracing the history with people, you're also making it pretty clear, this is stuff that's been in place for a very long time. So by definition, no one in your audience, just like in my audience, actually did it, right? The question is one of responsibility for addressing the world the way you find it, right? And so if you find a society in a particular state because someone else created it that way. And that society pays certain dividends to you for having been set up that way, and imposes certain costs and detriments on others because it was set up that way, then one can be entirely innocent of having created it and yet entirely responsible for helping to undo it. It's just like if I become the CEO of a corporation, God forbid, which I would never do nor aspire to, but if I did, I would not be able, at least theoretically, to go in and say, wow, I can't wait to take advantage of all the assets y'all built up after all these years without me even being here, because I didn't help you build them. I wasn't here. Y'all got me from that other company. I can't wait to use all these assets, but I have no intention of paying any of your outstanding debts, right? Because every company's got outstanding debts. They took out loans from the bank. They got a debt. Yeah, they have a balance ledger, right, that has assets and debts. I don't get to come in and be like, yeah, I'm not paying off that old loan y'all took out. That was that last CEO. You should have gotten it from him or her, right? I mean, that's bullshit. You can't say that. You got to be responsible for things when you find them. It's just like with pollution. Most of us in here don't have our own toxic waste dump in our backyard. We don't have our own smokestacks that belch toxic chemicals into the air, but someone else has done that, and we all pay the price for it. So now we have to decide, are we going to take responsibility for fixing it, or are we just going to sit back and let it happen? So there's a fundamental difference between guilt and responsibility. And we take responsibility for stuff all the time that we did not formally do. And this is true even in our own lives. Like ultimately, if a person is the victim of sexual abuse as a child or physical violence as a child, one is not to blame for what has happened to oneself, but one has to take some responsibility at some point as an adult for getting well, right, by getting the help that one needs and making sure our society provides the help that people need to overcome trauma and abuse. It's not that one is guilty, but one is going to try to take control of one's life so as not to pass down that dysfunction to one's own children, right? And so there's always a distinction. I don't think people should feel guilt. I'd like for them to be as upset as the targets have been, right? Maybe not for the same reason. I mean, the reason I added that stuff at the end of my talk about the cost of this system to white people, the psychological damage that's done when you buy into the myth of meritocracy and then you find yourself struggling for the first time, is to say, look, you don't have the luxury of feeling guilty. This shit is dangerous for you. This is dangerous. This is not healthy for you to not understand the way the world works. Because if white supremacy allows you to remain naive to the game, right? If white supremacy allows you to remain naive to how capitalism operates, if white supremacy allows you to remain naive to the way that the system really isn't merit-based, and then all of a sudden you find yourself struggling, I mean, maybe for all those years everything was cool. Maybe 364 days out of the year it was cool, but if day 365 is the day you got that pink slip and got fired from your job and you weren't ready for it, now what do? Because remember, the system told you wherever you end up is all about you. So if I'm on the unemployment line for 26 weeks, that voice in the back of my head is saying that I'm a loser, right? That voice in the back of my head is saying I'm a failure. I didn't work hard enough. I don't have the right values. I don't have what it takes. And the only thing I can do is either let that eat me alive and I come to hate myself, right? And maybe I turn to opiates, and maybe there's this research that came out that the one group that had an uptick in mortality over the last 13 years were middle-aged, non-college educated, working class white folks, right? Like black and brown folks' mortality rates continued to drop. They're still higher than the white rates, but they're going in the right direction. White folks, unemployed, I mean, not even unemployed, just working class, middle-aged white folks, their mortality went up. There were like an excess 300,000 deaths or something in that 13 years, and they were disproportionately from opioid overdoses, from cirrhosis of the liver brought on by heavy drinking, and suicide. Right? So what's going on? This is a group that is coming to realize that what they were told about America isn't real. They always assumed if they kept their nose clean and worked hard, it would work out, and it's not working out for them. And unlike people of color who always knew that it took more than simply hard work, they've never understood that. So in a sense, they've been set up by their own story, right? So I don't have time to feel guilty about that because that story's killing me. That story is dangerous for me. I have a self-interest in relinquishing it. So to feel guilty is to miss the point. Guilt is what I feel for the stuff I've done to somebody else. In this case, this is what we've done to ourselves. Yeah, we've done it to people of color. This narrative is done a real number on them, and system has done a number on them, but the irony is it's now doubling back on us. So we don't have the luxury of guilt. We got to get busy for our own sake. This isn't about charity, it's about self-help. All right. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, hello. Hello, good morning. My name is Shandine Hoyasik Yazi. I'm from Arizona, just visiting to Portland, and I got invited by my Aunt Maria. It's very interesting hearing what you have to say because a lot of it does apply to me. I am Navajo and Gila River Indian, so just one of the things that I have to deal with every day is kind of like where I live in the Southwest. There's a lot of issues affecting. I'm very involved into my community, and when it comes to sacred sites, I'm very more likely to be resistant towards a lot of colonization that we say. We always talk about decolonization and everything else, and we kind of have this hostility, but yet I try to educate people as well as not to be violent, but kind of educate somebody based on their ignorance. And that's kind of what we're heading towards. But a lot of times I'm dealing with more of like, because of our age group, there's like a lot of people that, you know, we talk about cultural apprehension. And a lot of times it's really hard because it's the desensitizing of, you know, this isn't, so one of the examples I'm trying to say is we have a sacred mountain that is in Flagstaff, San Francisco Peaks. That is, you know, a place where people go skiing and they don't see it as our sacred site. That's one of the most important mountains to a lot of cultures in the area. And it's very hard because whenever we're trying to speak out about it, people are like, well, we hardly see you natives even speaking your own language. We hardly see you Native Americans, you know, this and that, you know, you don't even know who you are.
Right.
And it's really hard because it's like we're fighting secret racism. People that, you know, won't admit what they're saying is bigotry, or, you know, they won't even say it, they won't even admit it. And it's really hard too, because whenever I go outside to a different area, like this past year I went to LA, I saw a lot of people wearing headdresses and I was so tempted to rip it off their heads, or, you know, like getting really fired up, like, oh, you have no idea. And it's very hard, and it's very hard when you're trying to educate somebody that it's not okay to wear a headdress if you're a female. It's not okay if you put on the tribal makeup. You know, that's like a thing. I don't even know why, but it's really hard dealing with that. And I just wanted to know, like, but what would I say to somebody that has no idea? And it's really hard because I'm not targeting out some people, but it's mostly, you know, there's like a term for it, but it's like these girls that just don't understand.
Right.
And it's hard too when you see it happening on your own reservation, where these girls are starting to become like those girls.
Yeah.
And it's very heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, and far be it from me to tell you sort of how to deal with that level of symbolic racism and cultural appropriation and misappropriation, because any advice I give you, like real concrete advice, I don't pay the price if it sucks, you know. So I want to be very cautious. I'm always very cautious about giving sort of concrete action steps to folks of color about how to deal with white supremacy. But I can at least say this much. I think that you know, one always is best served by recognizing that racist actions can have multiple motivations and places from which they emanate, right? The reason that's important to understand is, and it's hard sometimes, and it's especially hard for a person of color who's the target of white supremacy, but every racist act, I tend to focus more on the action than the person. And this is just as a strategic consideration, because in my experience, and I've certainly talked to enough other people to know it's their experience often as well, very little ever comes positively out of calling someone else a racist, like on a personal level. Now, there's some people you just got to say it about, like David Duke and Richard Spencer. Certain people, they're just racist, and you're never going to reach them, so you don't have to worry about how they're going to take it. Like, I don't care. I can call David Duke a neo-Nazi, and I don't care if he doesn't like it, because A, it's accurate, and B, he wasn't going to change his mind if I was sweeter to him, right? But for your average white person who does some stupid shit, whether that's putting on a headdress, not understanding the symbolism of that, not understanding what it means to indigenous peoples, or if it's someone who, you know, puts on costumage at Halloween that's indigenous, or in some other way, quote unquote, ethnic other than their own ethnicity as a European descended person. There are certainly people who do that for overtly racist reasons, and I would never deny that that's some of them. But then there are also those who act out of real learned ignorance. Now, I want to specify learned ignorance as opposed to pure naivete, because it's an ignorance that's been cultivated. That's why it's not innocent. It's systemically cultivated. There's a reason we don't know about indigenous peoples, and it's not indigenous folks' fault. Just like it's not indigenous folks' fault that many indigenous peoples don't know their native language. The language was taken. It was stripped. The culture was stripped. The religious tradition was stripped on purpose to, you know, in the famous words, to kill the Indian and save the man. So when people come by that kind of thinking as a result of ignorance, it's a very different response that one has to have than if they come at it from a place of racism. I always would tell not only people of color, but white aspiring allies as well, if you're dealing with someone who is appropriating someone's culture as a form of intentional mockery, I wouldn't waste any time trying to deal with them at all, because they're not really amenable to reason. On the other hand, people who act out of ignorance might well be, and it might be possible to engage a conversation about how that makes you feel and what that actually does symbolize and what it means, in a way that might, at least for some of them, get them to rethink. Obviously, you can't ensure that, and yes, there will be defensiveness whenever one suggests that someone is engaged in something that was racist. There's defensiveness, but there is still a difference between saying, hey, that thing you did was really inappropriate, as opposed to you are inappropriate as a human being and a horrible person and a racist, because I'm going to shut down if that's the way that and sometimes, you know, it's hard to distinguish between the two, but the action is the real problem. I usually think most people are pretty good folks, including the vast majority of these, you know, stupid folks who do really stupid shit. I think they're mostly good people who unfortunately have been miseducated about the symbolism of the things that they do. And you can always gauge when it's one and the other usually. Like if someone puts on blackface and it's MLK Day, I know what that shit's about, right? Like if you put on blackface on MLK Day or at your fraternity's Black History Month celebration, I can pretty well take for granted that you're not just being ignorant, that you're trying to be provocative in a way that's highly inappropriate and racist. On the other hand, if you go to a Halloween party and you know, like I'll tell you this story just to give you an idea. I mean, you're going to think I'm making this shit up, but I'm totally not making this up. I was at the University of Illinois, and it was right at the time that I was speaking there, and it was right at the time that they were having the big debate about the mascot, Chief Illiniwek, who was their indigenous native quote-unquote mascot. And the NCAA had just said you can't use Illiniwek anymore if you want to have tournament games at your home court. And so the University of Illinois trustees had just decided, okay, we're going to get rid of Illiniwek. They did it for the wrong reasons. They did it because they didn't want to lose revenue. But nonetheless, I don't care why you come to truth as long as you come, right? So they were getting rid of Illiniwek, and there was all this debate on the campus. Lots of people were angry about it. And so we're sitting there having that conversation. I was there for like 5 days and 4 days. And one day I'm having this discussion with these folks. And this guy who I guess was involved in the housing department, as I recall, said something about the school he had been at before. It wasn't the University of Illinois, but I thought it was, and I wrote about it as if it were, but I found out recently the guy said, oh, I was telling you it wasn't University of Illinois, it was my previous school. And I said, oh, okay, sorry, I messed the story up. Basically, his previous school, they had this interview process for somebody that wanted to be in residence life, like as an RA, right? And so just like when you want to be an RA on a campus, a resident advisor, you know, on the dorm floor, whatever, they interview you because it's a job that you get paid for. You get campus credit. I mean, you get like financial aid credit or whatever. So they brought this person in, and they're all sitting there ready to do the interview. And this young woman walks in, and she's in total blackface. This is a white woman, total blackface, afro wig. And these white folks who were doing the interview were like, the hell is this? They're looking at each other like, what is this some kind of candid camera punked thing? Like, what is this some kind of weird performance art? Like, they can't figure out what the hell is this girl doing because they know this girl. Can't figure her out. And she sits down and she smiles. She's all ready for her interview, and they're like, the hell, Mary? You know, like, what's wrong with you? You know, Becky, whatever your name is. And then Becky, Becky always gets picked on, right? That's always the name. But poor little Becky or whatever, they look at her and they go, well, what's going on with this? And she says, well, this seriously happened. Well, I got up this morning and I was nervous about this interview, but I wanted to get centered. So I decided that I would do better if I took on the persona of my absolute hero, Oprah Winfrey. And they looked at her like, the hell? You know, like seriously, like they just looked at her like, and they're waiting for her to go,
just kidding. Like, I know that's really stupid and I'm just being silly, but she was dead serious. And it's that moment where you go, and they were like, you know, that's like really, really racist. And this girl breaks down in like a complete come apart because she had no conception. Now, on the one hand, there's part of me that goes, I did not know there was that much stupid in the world. Like, there's part of me that says that, right? But then there's part of me that says, you know what? Where would she have learned about the historical meaning of blackface? Where? Where would she have learned? In American schools? Where? In that AP history class that I took that they didn't talk about that? It's like my senior year of college, there were 2 crosses burned at Tulane University in New Orleans. And they were both obviously racist acts. But one of the people in one of the fraternities where it happened, who was not one of the cross burners himself, showed up at a forum and said, we were all in a circle, like 50 of us, and we're talking it out. And this guy says, look, I know this is going to sound totally stupid, and y'all might want to yell at me, and that's fine. He said, but he said, look, I know why a burning cross offends me. He said, because I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, it offends me because it's a symbol of my faith, blah, blah, blah. But he said, I honestly, like, what is it about a burning cross that's specifically racist? And we're all looking at him like, oh. But then there's that moment where you go, oh, shit. Like, this kid, he didn't come and say that to be provocative or to be a jerk, right? He literally, he's an 18-year-old kid, 19-year-old young man who's sitting there, and he really is like honestly saying, I don't understand this. And it would have been easy to just sort of jump down his throat and be like, how could you be so stupid, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And there's still part of me that wants to go like, how could, but what schools did he go to? Where was he going to learn any of that? Yeah, I mean, to some of us, we might be like, well, come on, we've always known that, but you didn't always know it. Somebody taught you. Somebody taught you. Now, if you're a person of color, you might have learned from your family because they were trying to tell you that stuff. But if you're white in this country, how the hell are you going to learn any of that stuff? Unless you got a parent that teaches you, because they're not going to teach you in the schools. So that's not as an excuse for people who act that way. It's a way to say, hey, listen, can we have a conversation? And here's an important point for you as a woman of color. You got to decide when you feel safe to have that conversation. Because if you don't feel safe having it, don't try to have it. You need to get one of your white so-called allies to have that conversation with that person. You might need to take a break today. You might just be like, screw it, I don't have time to mess with you. I'm not going to try to explain this to you, but here, Becky, you say you're on my side. See, because Becky can be good too. She's not always bad. Becky, you need to come for your people. Right? Sometimes you have to enlist the rest of us who maybe have already learned a little something in the sharing of that truth, because it might not be safe for you in that moment. But when you feel it is, if you feel it is, if you handle it at the level of the action rather than the person, I think you get farther, for sure. Any other questions real quick? Yes.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just have an acknowledgement for you being here today and sharing, and I also have an acknowledgement for the community. My name is Cynthia Harris, and I'm the membership chair for 1120 NAACP, and we have a large amount of whites in this community that have come out to be members. We started 6 years ago. When I became a member with 15 members, we now have close to 300, and we're working on some key issues hard on the ground here in Portland. I'm from California originally. And if anybody wants to be a member, I do have membership forms, and I am doing a community breakfast trying to bring people together to share resources, very diverse, on May 23rd. So please see me if you'd like to participate.
Great.
So this is my 3rd time hearing you, and I get deeper every time. So I just want to acknowledge that and say we're doing some things here in Portland.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for being here. Any other questions or community share information or anything like that? Yeah.
Could you talk more about the idea of white individualism?
Yeah.
How do you help? How do I put that conclusion in? How do I help my friends, my family see that without
Right.
a jerk?
Well, I think the beauty of it, right, is that we don't have to engage it at the level of the abstract quantitative analysis. We can engage it at the level of our personal stories. I mean, the one thing that we all do have power over, because, there are people with different levels of power. Most of us don't feel very powerful. But the one piece of power we all have is the power of telling our own story. And if we're honest with ourselves, every one of us, whether we're white or of color, we've all had help, right, getting wherever it is that we are in life. No matter what it is that we've accomplished in life, whether it's getting into a certain school, getting a certain job, whatever it is that we've done that we feel good about, we had help getting there. No one has ever gotten where they got from point A to point B to point C on down the line without help. Now, some of that help has been racially connected. It's been about being white in part. Some of it's been about being men. Some of it's been about being upper middle class or affluent. Some of it, though, has just been about luck. So where I tell people to start is start with yourself. So I'll give you an example of what I mean, so I'll model it, right? So why am I here? Well, I'm here because I run my mouth reasonably well, but a lot of people do. I'm here because I'm a decent writer, but a lot of people are. That's not really the sum total of why I'm in the position that I'm in and have been doing this work for 27 years on a professional level. That's in large measure the result of a lot of things. Part of it's about whiteness, for sure, which allows my voice to carry in ways that many people of color don't. But it's also about whiteness in the sense that the only reason I got this work and started doing this right out of college was because I met two guys who gave me a job right out of school in New Orleans, Louisiana, fighting David Duke in 1990 and 91 when he ran for U.S. Senate and governor. And that brought me to the attention of sort of the civil rights and anti-racism community because I was 23, 24 years old, 22 years old, doing really high-level anti-racism work in those campaigns, which was a major national and international news story. If I don't meet those guys and they don't give me that job, I'm not going to come to national attention for doing this work. But how did I meet those guys? I met them because I went to Tulane in New Orleans, which is where one of them was a teacher and one was a grad student. The only reason I was at Tulane was because even though I didn't really have enough money to afford to go there, my mom was able to go to the bank and get a loan for $12,000 to bridge the gap between the financial aid they were offering and what it was going to cost my first year in 1986. But how did we get a loan? We didn't own any property. We lived in an apartment my whole life, 850 square foot apartment from day 3 of my life until I went to college. So we didn't have collateral, we didn't have property, we didn't have credit, but my mom was able to use her mom to co-sign the loan. My grandmother, who was living in the 5th house that she had lived in with my grandfather by that time, a house that they couldn't have had if they hadn't been white, because they couldn't have lived in that neighborhood where the property was appreciating at this really high rate. So in a very real sense, the only reason I'm at Tulane, able to meet those men who were able to give me that job and therefore allow me to build up my reputation as an anti-racist activist or scholar is because of the whiteness that gave me a certain head start. But it's even deeper than that, because put aside the white piece for a minute, the only reason I was at Tulane, the real reason I went to Tulane is I was chasing a girl that was going to Louisiana State, right? It's bottom line. My girlfriend, my senior year of high school, was a student from Louisiana who I knew from the national debate circuit. She was going to LSU. We met during the summer before senior year at a debate camp. Now I'm totally a geek, clearly. We meet at debate camp in Washington, D.C., and she convinces me in the manner of a really stupid 16, 17-year-old in love, you've got to go to Tulane, Tim. If you go to Emory in Atlanta, which is where I was going to go, we're never going to see each other, you know? We won't be able to see each other, so you've got to go to Tulane because then we'll only be like an hour and 15 minutes apart. And I said, of course, dear, I will totally change my entire life plan for you. Which I'm totally not bitter about, because even though it didn't work out, it all worked out for the best for both she and myself. But I only go to Tulane because of her. So the reality is, if I don't meet her, I don't go to Tulane, I don't meet those men, I don't get that job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the only reason I met her was because I was a high school debater. The only reason I was a high school debater was because after my freshman year, when I tried out for the baseball team, I used to be a really good athlete. I was a very good baseball player and actually was good enough when I was like 11 or 12. I had college recruiters come into my game. So I figured that was like my path. I was going to play ball. But I had a horrible, inexplicably terrible tryout for my high school team and got cut. So I had to find another activity, right? If I make the baseball team, which by all rights I should have, given my talent level, then I wouldn't have had time to be a debater. I certainly wouldn't have had time in the summer to go to a summer debate workshop and camp in Washington, D.C. I wouldn't have met Monica. I wouldn't have ended up at Tulane. I wouldn't have met those men. So really what I'm trying to say is that the only reason I'm standing here is because that asshole that cut me from the baseball team, and God bless him, right? Like ultimately, even my bad luck is what made it possible for me to be here. Now, none of that takes away from whatever skills I have. None of that takes away from my talents as a writer or as a public speaker or as a thinker or whatever, right? But it is to say that without certain totally serendipitous things happening, and I guarantee you every one of you's got stories like that. Like everybody's got a story about how if one thing goes differently, everything else in your life is different. And even folks of color who don't have the white privilege piece have got somebody that came into their life, a family member, a mentor, a teacher, somebody who gave them a chance, you know. And I think if we're all willing to tell our story and be real humble about the fact that we didn't really earn what we have in the formal sense of the word, that it becomes a lot easier for other people to admit that, right? Like if I'm willing to go first,
first and say, hey, I didn't earn all the stuff I have. A lot of this is just luck. Somebody else will be more willing to say that. Nobody wants to go first, right? Nobody wants to raise their hand and be like, oh, I have a lot of unearned opportunity. But if I'm willing to go first and just put my stuff in the street, right, then other people might be like, oh, well, me too. And then pretty soon we're having a conversation that's very different, because the minute we as a society start breaking down that idea of rugged individualism is the minute that it becomes harder to judge people at the bottom. It becomes far more difficult to judge people who are struggling when we acknowledge publicly and openly that that could be us very easily if one thing goes differently. And so in that sense, like, that's something we can all take charge of right now. We might not have the power to revolutionize the system today. We might not have the power, or there are some people who just are, in terms of their disposition, are not disposed to like major protest activity or major movement activity. There always will be people like that who just for whatever reason are not going to go into the streets. They're not going to knock on their neighbor's door. They're not going to do the kind of stuff that, is sort of higher profile. But that doesn't mean they can't do something. It's about sharing your story. It's about challenging these narratives. We can all do that, and we can start with ourselves. We don't have to be an expert. We don't have to have a bunch of statistics in our head, because we know our story. And if we tell our story, we can connect that to a larger political discussion in a way that's not judgmental. It's not about saying, my great-grandfather, on my father's side, came here from Russia in the early 1900s as a Jewish immigrant, and I have absolutely no doubt caught hell both as a Jew and as an immigrant and a non-English speaker. And I can credit and honor his 18-hour-a-day workdays, while at the same time acknowledging that he also had opportunity to jobs that had been off limits to people of color by the time he got to New York City for 20 to 25 years. Admitting that doesn't take away from his hard work, right? It doesn't say, oh, your hard work isn't why you succeeded. No, the hard work was important, but he was also met with an opportunity structure that even in spite of his mistreatment, he had access to. So we can do both of these things. We can acknowledge, most people who succeed have had to work relatively hard, not always. Most people, because hard work, you're not going to survive in a really hyper-competitive society if you don't put forth some effort. But the point is, virtually everyone puts forth effort, and not everyone's effort is rewarded. And that's where we can, I think, make the connection between the individual and the larger society, and get us out of this mentality of the isolated human being, because that mentality is not really healthy for us, precisely for the reason that I said. It only works for you if you're winning. And the minute you start losing is the minute it no longer works for you. In fact, it becomes toxic, right? It's like, rugged individualism is great as long as you're on top and you can content yourself with the idea that you're kicking ass because you're just so kick-ass and awesome. And then the minute that something happens, it could be the collapse of a relationship or a marriage. It could be the loss of a job. It could be, a disability that makes it where you can't earn a living anymore. I mean, any of those things that suddenly sideline you or take you off the path of success that you were on. And if all you've got is a narrative that says where you end up is all about your own effort, there's no healthy way to deal with that now. You have to either hate yourself or you have to find somebody to blame and scapegoat for your pain. And in neither of those cases will your pain stop. In neither of those cases will the source of your pain ever be addressed. And so I think if we can convince people that rugged individualism is not only mythical, which I think at some level we all know whether we want to admit it, but it's actually a dangerous ideology. We actually want to pathologize the ideology. So it's not enough to say it's not true. It's not true, and it's dangerous to continue to hold on to. It's actually an ideology that can hurt you. That's why you want to get rid of it. That you actually have a self-interest in relinquishing your faith in this because it isn't healthy. And I think we're seeing some of the effects of that right now. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.